Welcome to video 2. This is the first major topic of our class, which I titled Scientific Method. In this video, we'll be covering some basic vocabulary for research methods. We'll also cover a few different types of research, and we'll cover the advantages and disadvantages of each type of research we discuss. But first of all, whenever I teach this class in person, I like to start this topic with a question. I like to ask my students, what is a psychologist? When I ask this question, I'm hoping to see if my students believe that there's only one type of psychologist, because there's actually more than one type of psychologist. And right now, let's go over the two major types of psychologists that are out there. The two major types of psychologists are people who practice psychology and scientists who study behavior. So let's quickly define these two types of psychologists, and then we'll cover at least one example of each type. So a person who practices psychology is a person who uses the knowledge we've gained about human behavior to either help people or to solve real-world problems. A very common example of this first type of psychologist is a clinical psychologist who delivers therapy. This is the example that the general public is most familiar with for this first type of psychologist. Another example that fits into this first category is an industrial psychologist or an IO psychologist. If you've ever taken a class in industrial organizational psychology, you're probably familiar with what an IO psychologist does. An IO psychologist is someone who's hired by a company or some type of organization to oversee psychological issues in the workplace. So an IO psychologist is responsible for things like improving employee motivation, or maybe developing training programs and measuring the effectiveness of those training programs. The second major type of psychologist is a scientist who studies behavior. This type of psychologist is typically called a research psychologist or an experimental psychologist. And this type of psychologist is almost always a professor at a university who does research on a certain topic in addition to teaching. And a research psychologist will have a more specific title that tells you his or her area of psychology. So a developmental psychology professor who teaches classes in developmental psychology and does research on a developmental topic would be called a developmental psychologist. Or a person who teaches cognitive psychology and does research on a cognitive type topic, like memory, for example, would be called a cognitive psychologist. And if you go to a research university where psychological research is done, every full-time professor there will be some type of research psychologist. So one person might be a cognitive psychologist, another person might be a developmental psychologist, and someone else might be a social psychologist. So now we've covered the two major types of psychologists. Now let's move ahead and talk about the meaning of the word research. So the purpose of this class, research methods, is to learn how to do research in psychology, or to learn how research is done in psychology. So first we have to understand the meaning of this term, research. Research is just the process of gathering information about a topic. It's something that we do every day of our lives. Each time you look up something on your phone, you're doing research. Each time you ask a friend or a fellow college student to tell you what they think of a certain professor or a certain class, you're doing research. Now let's talk about the two major types of research, or the two most broad categories of research. The two major types of research are secondary and primary research. Let's go through them one at a time. Secondary research is research in which information is gathered from published sources. So anytime a person gathers information from a published source, like a textbook, or an article, or a website, the person is doing secondary research. When a person does secondary research, the person is gathering information that someone else has already gathered. The person isn't gathering any new original information. And as a college student, this is the research that you've done the most up to this point. So if you've ever had to write a paper for a class and you've had to go and look up articles for your paper, you were doing secondary research. And the opposite of secondary research is primary research. Primary research is research in which information is gathered directly from the world. It's research in which a person gathers information directly from the people, animals, things, or places that he or she wants to learn about. And there are many different types of primary research that we'll learn about in this class. Some examples of primary research are surveys, observation in public locations, or interviews. And in this class, it'll be, or it might, for many of you, it'll be your first opportunity to do primary research. Each student in our class is going to get into a group and plan out some type of primary research project. And the it's up to you what type of research you want to do. What I'm going to have you do is just choose a topic first, and then decide what research method you think is most appropriate for your topic. And I'll provide some guidance. So if I think that your topic, if I think that your method that you're planning to use isn't very suited to your topic, I'll just suggest that you use a different method. So yeah, that's the difference between secondary and primary research. Before we move on, I want to make sure that everyone understands the difference between secondary and primary research and secondary and primary sources. It's important not to confuse those terms because the difference between secondary and primary research is different. It's not the same thing as the difference between secondary and primary sources. So if you've ever taken a writing class, you might have learned that a research article that reports a new study is a primary source, and a source like a textbook or a lit review that just summarizes other sources is secondary. It's a secondary source. And let me explain where those terms come from. So a primary source, a research article that reports the results of a study for the first time is called a primary source because the author who wrote that article did primary research. The author went out and gathered new original data, maybe by doing a survey, and then the person published an article that reports his or her findings. So the person did primary research, and the article that was written is a primary source, reporting a piece of primary research. But if a student comes along later and looks up that article and reads about it, that student is doing secondary research, right? So it might help to imagine a timeline of events. First, a researcher goes out and gathers a new set of data, maybe by doing a survey, and does primary research. Then that researcher publishes an article reporting his or her findings. And since the person is reporting a piece of primary research, the article is called a primary source. And later on, maybe a year later, when a student looks up that article, that student is doing secondary research because the student is looking up a published source. The student isn't going out and gathering his or her own information. So hopefully that helps you. Now let's move ahead and talk about the two major types of primary research. In psychology, the two major types of primary research are experimental and non-experimental research. And we'll actually talk about these in the next part of the video. We'll pick up right where we left off.